Okay, I think we can start off just so that we keep time. So welcome everybody to our Tax Talk 51, dealing with illicit financial flows and the promise of a UN tax convention. Our presenter is Alex Cobham. Alex is the Chief Executive of the Tax Justice Network, which is an international organization established in 2003 to ensure that our tax and financial systems support social justice within and between countries. He's an economist and he has researched on tax and inequality at Oxford University, the Center for Global Development, Christian Aid and Save the Children, and has consulted for a range of UN agencies. His recent books include The Uncounted and Estimating Illicit Financial Flows. And he is also a member of the Scottish Government's Poverty and Inequality Commission. So thank you so much, Alex, for agreeing to join us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mary, and to the Committee for Fiscal Studies. It's a great honour to be giving one of your tax talks. This is particularly timely, not entirely coincidentally, because we did work on this, but the African Union Economic Commission for Africa ministerial meeting earlier this week has given the biggest shot in the arm to the prospect of a UN tax convention that it's ever had. I think it's fair to say, and so it's timely that we're talking about this today. Arguably, this is the biggest piece of the tax justice agenda, and you could say that while the movement has made enormous progress on individual policy areas, such as automatic exchange of information on financial accounts, beneficial ownership, transparency, country-by-country reporting by multinationals, even on some of the aspects of the corporate tax agenda, where there has been least progress is in the democratization of the setting of those rules. And that's what a UN tax convention is really designed to address. So I'm going to talk through in the next hour or perhaps 50 minutes the reasons why tax matters, the reasons why we're in the position we're in terms of the global inequalities in taxing rights that face lower income countries, but also almost all of us in households at different income levels, in countries at different income levels around the world, and then what that policy agenda is to address that, and why the UN Tax Convention is such a key element in responding to it. And then a little bit on perhaps the prospects for the convention and where we go from now after this important statement from the AU ministerial this week. But I will share my screen if I can. No, I won't. Mary, might you be able to enable me to share my screen? And I will inflict some slides on us all. Well, I will continue talking perhaps while Mary is, I hope, able to.
I was speaking and I was on mute. I think you should have the rights now, so maybe just try.
Oh yes, thank you.
Okay.
Good. This will be marginally less incoherent if I can see the slides too. Thank you. So the title is taking back Control of Illicit Financial Flows, the Promise of a UN Tax Convention. And I'll talk through a bit, though I think we all know what illicit financial flows are and the role of tax in particular in respect to that. Here is the statement from earlier this week.
There is no room for appeal.
This is a statement from the African Union Economic Commission for Africa Conference of Ministers. The way this went through was as an expert resolution, which is commended and backed by the conference itself. So the conference calls upon the United Nations to begin negotiations under its auspices on an international convention on tax matters with the participation of all states, members, and relevant stakeholders, aimed at eliminating base erosion, profit shifting, tax evasion, including of capital gains tax, and other tax abuses. So they are reflecting, if you like, on the full breadth of tax-motivated illicit financial flows and calling for a completely inclusive global process of negotiations to set a convention in place. Now, I'll come back in a while to what that might mean in terms of the substance of a convention, and then what it might mean politically in terms of where we go from here. But this is a significant step to have the collective ministers of finance of the African Union calling explicitly for the UN to begin negotiations on a convention. Okay, briefly, I will go through these 4 points. So why tax matters, and particularly the 4 R's of tax. How we got here? 3 imperial ages of illicit financial flows, tracing the line back in the emergence of illicit financial flows as a dominant feature of our economy and indeed our global society. And then looking at the policy responses, and particularly the African leadership that has characterized policy responses in this area over the last couple of decades, really. And then finally focusing on the proposals for a UN tax convention and how they might finally change the dynamics in the way that seems crucial for the kind of progress that we need. So the 4 R's of tax, you may well be familiar with. This goes back to some work almost 20 years ago, just looking to provide a bit of a framing for our understanding of tax, a kind of a reasonably simple way to communicate why tax matters. Most obviously, the first R of tax is revenue. Although there are other ways of raising revenue, it is the case that tax provides us with the only long-term, sustainable, and crucially independent source of revenue for our states to fund inclusive public services. And it matters, it turns out, where the money comes from, but I'll get onto that. Just for context, our State of Tax Justice report, published with by Tax Justice Network with the Global Alliance for Tax Justice and Public Services International, finds that something like 483 billion, let's call it $500 billion of revenue are lost every year around the world because of only the cross-border tax abuses of the largest multinational companies and of wealthy individuals hiding their assets offshore. Now, as you'd expect, the biggest economies lose the largest amount in absolute terms, but it's lower income countries overwhelmingly that lose the greatest share of their current tax revenues. Now, it's also lower income countries whose tax revenues typically make up the smallest part of their GDP, the smaller share of their economy. And so losing a bigger share of those revenues equates to an even bigger share of their public spending budgets. So last year's State of Tax Justice report found, I think, higher income countries losing something ranging between about 2 and 10% of their public health budgets, Lower income countries, in contrast, losing on average almost 50% of their public health budgets to these forms of cross-border tax abuse. So a much more intense problem for lower income countries, though a problem that affects countries, as I say, at all income levels. Because it's also about stripping the possibility of progressive taxation, even where higher income countries can raise enough revenues from other sources. The way that they raise tax is also distorted by this. To put that in that number in some context, that's one nurse's salary being lost every single second of every year to a tax haven. The second R of tax, though, is redistribution, and this is equally crucial. So as I say, higher income countries may be able to raise revenues from other sources, but they too are suffering because the ability to tax progressively, to tax profits and incomes and capital gains, is stripped away by those cross-border tax abuses. And the effect of that is that while public services may be at a higher level than the average lower income country, the way that that's being paid for is less redistributive. Higher income countries, like lower income countries, are relying more and more on indirect taxation, on taxing consumption in particular, which means that lower income households are paying a greater share, and that there's less redistribution away from the higher income households at the top end. And that leaves us all with more unequal societies. So everyone is losing out because of this failure to tackle cross-border tax abuse. To give a sense of how that looks, this is an example using data from Brazil in the early 2000s, but in terms of the shape of the couple of graphs I'm going to show, actually, this is a story that's common to almost every country in almost every recent period. So look, the graph shows household groups from left to right increasing by income. So at the bottom end here, we've got households whose complete income is less than twice the national minimum wage. And that moves up the scale to the far end where we have households with more than 30 times the national minimum wage as an income. Okay. Now, the share of the income that is being taken in direct taxes is illustrated on the scale. So for the lowest income households, it's only 3% or so of their income is going in taxes, rising to around 10% for the highest income households. So this is a reasonably low level of direct taxation, but it's very much the progressive schedule that you'd hope to see. The more income households have, the greater share they're contributing in direct taxes. Okay, if we look at indirect taxes, unsurprisingly, the picture flips, and we find that lower income households are paying a bigger share of their incomes, quite a dramatically bigger share, in fact, than in indirect taxes, than are the higher income households at the right-hand side of this graph. That's to be expected, and it's the concern that we always have with a reliance on indirect taxes. But the real issue is what you see in this final graph. When you put these two together, it's the regressive schedule of indirect taxes that completely dominates. So what we have for Brazil in the particular period is that the lowest income households are paying almost half of their incomes in taxes, the great majority of that in indirect taxes, while the highest income households are only paying around a quarter of their incomes in tax. And that's split much more equally between direct and indirect taxes. And I'll come back to why that matters. But what this is showing you is just the tax injustice faced by households across the income distribution. Now let's add something else into that. What this data picks up, and almost all of the data we have in almost every country about households and their assets and incomes and their tax contributions, this is in a sense the data on people and households who are relatively well formalized, who are counted by state systems. And of course, not everyone is. We already know, in terms of the people, the households in this graph, that those households at the low income end are disproportionately likely to be households headed by women, households including people living with disabilities, including people from sexual minorities, LGBT groups, people from ethno-linguistic minorities, indigenous peoples, racial minorities or racialized, minoritized groups, to give that the emphasis it should have. So already we're seeing this isn't just increasing inequalities between people randomly distributed. This is increasing inequalities that already face certain groups in a particularly harsh way. The tax system is making those worse. Now, the phenomenon of the uncounted tells us a bit more about this, that in fact there are people off the edge of this graph who are again disproportionately likely to be in those groups, disproportionately likely to be minoritized in various ways and already suffering from significant inequalities. And they will be uncounted entirely. They will be lower incomes and incomes that are outside the formal system. And so the measured inequality at the low end of the distribution will be even worse than we see in that Brazil graph or the equivalent for other countries. And meanwhile, at the top end, we have a feature, again, consistent across countries, that the top 10% of households by income, and in particular the top 1% and the top 0.1%, are the key movers in tax evasion. These are the households that are hiding their assets and income streams from the tax authorities. And so at that end of the distribution, we have uncounted money, which again makes the actual distribution of income significantly more unequal than what we're able to see in the kind of data from the previous graph. So we need to be cognizant that including people in the tax system and with that, including them in the systems for public spending, public transfers, is crucial to capturing the full distribution and being able to make sure the tax system is as redistributive as we would like, and that the inequality that we end up with is the true one, rather than this very misleading measured inequality that we currently have, that we see on this picture that keeps moving in front of us. I'll take that off. Okay, that's revenues and redistribution. The third R of tax is repricing. And this is the fact that our tax systems are central to any ability we have to change the price of public goods and public bads. I won't dwell on this here, but two particular examples perhaps to explain that. The most obvious one for a long time has been tobacco consumption. When an individual consumes tobacco, it has impacts for their health, short-term and longer term, and for public health, for the health of the people around them. Choosing to smoke a cigarette puts social costs into play. It creates a future cost for the public health system. Now, if that cost isn't reflected in the price of the cigarette to the individual is given the incentive to smoke more, to consume more tobacco than is good for society. I mean, we might think the optimum level of tobacco consumption is zero, but for the moment, at least, while it's allowed to be above zero, we ought to be taxing it to capture the entire social costs. And this is why the big tobacco companies put so much effort into trying to prevent effective tobacco taxation, because they recognize that if the full social cost was included in the price of tobacco, there would be very, very few cigarettes being sold. A bigger existential threat, though, is around the pricing of carbon and other environmental impacts. If we do not price in the cost to the environment, to the planet, for all of us of carbon emissions, then companies have the incentive to continue production in a way that damages the planet more than we can all afford. If we don't have tax systems that can change effectively the prices of carbon emissions and other types of environmental and biodiversity damage, we are going to burn the planet on which we all depend even quicker than we are already. We need our tax systems to be effective to deliver repricing that we all need for our futures and our children's futures. The fourth R of tax, though, is the one that's most often overlooked and arguably the most important, and that's representation. You probably know the old American Civil War cry for independence from the British: no taxation without representation. They didn't want to pay tax as a colony if they didn't have political representation in London, in Westminster. A familiar claim from British colonies around the world over the last couple of 100 years, shamefully. But it turns out the evidence suggests that relationship's really the other way around. There is no effective representation without taxation. It is the process of being taxed that in turn drives an accountability relationship and makes states responsive to citizens. So we find over time, one of the only things consistently associated with improvements in the quality of government, with reductions in corruption, is the share of government expenditures that comes from taxation. When you have long-term reliance on other sources of funding, including debt, but particularly natural resource wealth and foreign aid, you don't get these accountability relationships emerging in the same way. It's the reliance of governments upon taxing their citizens that over time makes governments less corrupt, better governed, more responsive, makes the political systems of representation more effective over time. Now think back to this graph. Who's being represented? The other thing we know about representation is that the relationship is particularly strong for direct taxes. It's the direct taxes on incomes and profits and capital gains that we as people and households are most aware of because they're direct. They are the most salient to us. And so when we're paying that sort of tax, we are most inclined to start thinking that the government is spending our money. And how do we hold government to account? How do we demand that government spends our money better? Indirect taxes, things like value-added tax, VAT, taxes on different types of on trade and different types of goods and services don't have the same effect. They're not as salient to us, and therefore they don't drive this accountability relationship in the same way. So think of this graph. At the left-hand end, we have low-income households disproportionately headed by women, disproportionately including minoritized groups of different types, paying much more of their incomes in tax, but almost entirely in indirect taxes. So they're not being politically empowered to the same extent as the households at the high end, paying much less of their income in tax, but a much bigger share in direct taxes. And this is what the Brazilian study found, that tax citizenship is much higher at the high income end of the distribution, even though these households are paying much less in tax overall. So the great risk is that our tax systems are not only economically regressive, making inequalities worse in terms of incomes or failing to reduce those inequalities, but they're also politically regressive. They are empowering, or they risk empowering, the people and households with the highest incomes paying less of their income in tax, more than they empower people on lower incomes who are paying a higher share of their incomes in tax. So Tax is a major and central determinant of political representation, and ineffective tax systems are going to give us less accountable, less representative governments, governments that are less interested for that reason in pursuing progressive policies and have less fiscal space to do so. One last piece of research on this is a bit of work we did on tax and health. And what this shows is that when a bigger share of government expenditure comes from tax, a bigger share of expenditure is likely to be on health. So governments prioritize health more when they're more reliant on tax. For the same amount of money that they then spend on health, that spending, if more of it is coming from tax, is associated with better outcomes and with more inclusive outcomes. So more people are brought into the public health system, and people in general have better health outcomes without any more money being spent, just the quality of the money being different because more of it's coming from tax. So these relationships are really fundamental to the types of public services government deliver and how inclusively they deliver them. And this should run all the way through our thinking that this isn't just about a bit more money. It's the quality of the money and therefore the quality of the states that we have that depends on tax in this way. Okay, now tax is only one determinant of rights and inequalities. But when tax systems fail, when we don't have effective taxes and we don't get the 4 Rs, we end up with inequalities and all sorts of intersectional overlapping inequalities that are needlessly high. And our progress towards human rights, including centrally towards women's rights, is needlessly bad. We are throwing away opportunities to make things better when we don't have a tax system that can deliver on the 4 Rs. Okay. That's a long preamble to why this all matters, and I will move a bit quicker through the next sections. But I think it's important to have that starting place about why this matters for all of us. Okay, flipping things around a bit, let's think about why there are problems. Why, in fact, we have illicit financial flows, particularly dominated by the tax-related illicit financial flows that are so large, so pervasive, and so undermining of the 4 Rs of tax. And a lot of this can be traced back more and less directly to the imperial legacies, is not even the right word, to the fact that we live in a world that is arguably imperial still rather than post-imperial in a significant way. We are living in a world that is characterized still very fully by the fact that a small group of mainly European countries had large and powerful empires dominating most of the world during most of the last couple of 100 years. Okay, illicit financial flows, you all know this, but we're talking really about the cross-border transfer of funds motivated by 4 different things: the laundering of the proceeds of crime, grand corruption, the theft of state assets, the abuse of market regulations, things like regulations to prevent monopoly positions, regulations to prevent the exploitation of political conflicts of interest, and finally, but most importantly, corporate and individual tax abuse. Now, all of these different channels, and there's a multitude of ways in which you can achieve any and all of these, but have 2 common features. They are hidden and they are damaging. They are hidden because whether they're strictly illegal or not, they are socially unacceptable at the very least. And that applies to corporate tax avoidance, even when it might arguably be just the right side of the legal line. Companies want to hide this because they know that it is socially unacceptable to be seen to trying to undermine the revenues of the states in which they're making their money. And similarly for all other illicit flows. And they're damaging. They do damage across the piece to the 4 Rs. They undermine our ability to have systems of progressive taxation. So they undermine our revenues, they undermine our redistribution. They make it almost impossible to reprice effectively if you can simply circumvent and, for example, smuggle your tobacco in rather than bringing it through the formal channels and so on. And of course, they undermine representation. They give us governments that are more prone to corruption and less responsive to us as citizens. So they are pervasive and damaging across this whole set of areas in which tax is central to effective states. 3 imperial ages, and I will try and run through this a little quicker. The first imperial age, the one we kind of tend to think of most easily as associated with empire, is the age of open violence, of slavery, of colonial occupation, and of direct extraction of resources, including human beings, by force. Now, within that, there are also some somewhat more hidden channels. The UK and Dutch governments, in particular, use charter companies, in a sense, private companies, but with a direct grant of power from the state, which were often given entirely illegitimately control of tax-raising powers, and were also most famously, in the case of the East India Company, but in fact with many others, given the ability to manipulate trade prices in a way that effectively you can think of as the first transfer pricing manipulation. So to make sure that Indian traders, for example, were given much lower prices than the world market price for the goods that the East India Company then took to the UK and sold onto the world market for a much higher markup. So these were ways in which the level of extraction was, in fact, financially was much greater than what you could see most directly from the open violence that was the more obvious characterization of that period. Now, the second imperial age of illicit flows emerged from this as the world was moving towards independence, and you could see the beginning of the end of empire coming. So you had these two threats, if you like, at the same time. I say threats. These are only threats if you are someone who has made your money during that first period of open extraction of violence. You're worried about two things. Firstly, you're worried that a colony may become independent and may then expropriate you. That's to say, it may then take back some or all of what you have stolen during the period of empire. But then alongside that, you're also worried that if you can take all of your money, all of your illicit gains back to the imperial metropolis, well, they've just started taxing in a much more serious way and taxing income and wealth. So you don't want to do that either. Now, look, if you think that expropriation by the colony as it becomes independent is illegitimate, because you don't think for some reason that the colony has a right to tax or to reclaim what you've stolen, then you ought to think that the metropolis, the imperial power, does have a right to tax you, because you could only do the theft because they allowed you to. So you have to be clear in your mind that, in a sense, you're going to cheat both of these countries, both of these states, in order to think that it's reasonable for you to hide your money away from them both. And that's exactly what the emerging structures were designed to do. We see in the early 20th century, particularly, the emergence of often smaller dependent territories within empires, especially the British one, that are offering the ability to hide the gains, hide the capital and the income streams, both from the colony that might or has become independent and from the metropolis. These early tax havens set the path for what was to come. And that's the period we're now living in, and really has been kind of the dominant age since the 1950s and 60s, what we might call tax haven empire. A set of secrecy jurisdictions and corporate tax havens around the world, they're really central to this era of globalization. Now, I'm not going to get into this bit, but that's in a sense what the Tax Justice Network and allies across the Global Alliance for Tax Justice are really about, tracking this phenomenon and starting to push back against it. The Financial Secrecy Index, and you may have seen Tuesday, we launched the 2022 index, showing that the United States is now the biggest global threat in terms of the provision of financial secrecy that facilitates illicit financial flows, damaging other countries all around the world. Every other year, we produce the Corporate Tax Haven Index that focuses on the multinational company tax abuse element of tax havenry. And on an ongoing basis, the Illicit Flows Vulnerability Tracker that allows you to drill down at the country level into which jurisdictions are posing the biggest threat to you, whether that's in commodity trade, portfolio investment, banking flows, direct investment, and so on, which jurisdictions are the biggest illicit flow risk. And of course, the State of Tax Justice reports that give you a sense of which countries are imposing revenue losses on the rest of the world and what revenue losses each country suffers in terms of cross-border corporate tax abuse and offshore tax evasion by individuals. What that allows us to see, though, is a pattern. So you get this analysis at the country level, which jurisdictions are doing what damage. And here's a case of the Netherlands, a very high-ranking corporate tax haven, but also a major financial secrecy jurisdiction responsible for very substantial losses of revenue by other countries around the world. Equally, here's Guyana. We see a whole set of countries losing very substantially. Guyana's a particularly extreme case, losing about 3 times its public health budget to the tax abuses that are made possible by other states. When you look at that picture in the round, this table's slightly out of date, so I haven't put the new index releases in there, but the picture, I'm sorry to say, remains the same. The UK, with its network of dependent territories, both overseas territories and crown dependencies, is the biggest actor by a distance. In secrecy terms, the US is the biggest individual actor. In corporate tax havenry, it's the Netherlands that the next biggest, but the UK, combined with its dependent territories, is the biggest threat to all of us globally. And of course, when you look at the set of OECD member countries, this group of rich countries, they dominate completely whichever way we cut this, whether we look at the risks of financial secrecy, the risks of corporate tax havenry, or the estimates of revenue losses imposed on others. It is OECD members that are responsible for the bulk of the revenue losses and the illicit flow risks suffered. That tax abuse is like trusting a pack of wolves to build a fence around your chicken coop. How we move from here to a system where there is an inclusive representation of countries at different income levels in the setting of the rules and standards is the key challenge of illicit financial flows. The policy agenda is, I think, well established. And this is stuff that the Tax Justice Network set out as a policy platform when we were established in 2003 over the next couple of years. And it's, in a sense, not controversial anymore. It was completely utopian, unrealistic. The OECD and others told us this will never happen. We can see the argument, but it's wild. It'll never get close to this. Now this is the global policy agenda. But none of it still is delivered in a way that includes countries at all income levels, and therefore none of it is delivered in a way that's truly effective. So we know what we need, we're just not doing it. Automatic exchange of financial account information, ending bank secrecy, but including all of the major financial centers and to end their secrecy, and countries at all income levels so that everyone can benefit. Part of the reason the United States is at the very top of the financial secrecy index is because it's the one major financial center that refuses to provide automatic exchange of this information, even at the same time as it demands it from every other country in the world. You want to talk about imperialism being in the past? It's here today. Beneficial ownership transparency. We're on the road here. We have an increasing number of public registries of the ultimate warm-blooded human being behind companies in a growing number of countries, but we need that also for trusts and foundations and partnerships, other legal vehicles. We need it for high-value assets. Everything from, the yachts, the luxury yachts of Russian oligarchs, through to high-value works of art and so on. And ultimately, we need that all joined up in a global asset registry, combining public and private information so that we, citizens, can see the inequalities in the distribution of wealth within our countries and consider whether we want to start taxing wealth in a serious way, and so that law enforcement and tax authorities can see the full distribution, including private data, and make sure that law enforcement against illicit financial flows and the enforcement of taxation is effective and is not thwarted with the current ease by the way that we tolerate anonymous wealth. And country by country reporting, some basic information to allow us to see when multinationals are declaring profits in one place, but carrying out all their activity in another, to really give us the way in to stop profit shifting. And that brings us to the corporate tax reforms that, increasingly are recognized as needed. Even the OECD process, of which the current proposals deliver little or nothing for most countries, especially lower income countries, but even that process has recognized two key things. The arm's length principle, set in place by the imperial powers at the League of Nations in the 1920s and 30s, is no longer fit for purpose. We need to move towards unitary alternatives where we assess multinationals' profits at the global level, at the unit of the multinational group as a whole, and then apportion that between countries according to where the economic activity is, to eliminate the possibility of profit shifting. And we need a minimum effective tax rate to remove the incentive for profit shifting. This is all clear. Why don't we have it? We don't have it because we don't have mechanisms to set these rules and standards that are globally inclusive. The OECD has created what it calls the inclusive framework to have some non-OECD members within the process. Those members have no vote. The first thing that happened in the current OECD process was that the inclusive framework set a work plan for the Secretariat, including the proposals of the G24 group of lower income countries. They said, here are 3 proposals to the Secretariat. This is your job. Go and evaluate these and come back and tell us how each of them would look for each of us. The Secretariat never did that because the US and France began negotiating bilaterally and the G7 supported them. So the Secretariat ripped up the work plan of the inclusive framework. There's nothing inclusive about that. And we've heard from the African Tax Administrators Forum in particular and others that the G7 have taken all the decisions. It is not an inclusive framework just because it has the word inclusive in the title. As the Indian negotiator famously said, without voting rights, there is nothing inclusive. And that, in a sense, is why we need to reform the global architecture, not just have the policy ideas on the agenda. The high-level FACTI panel last year really brought together the recommendations that have been made by many countries, and particularly following the Mbeki panel recommendations over the years, and the proposals of the G77 group and the Africa group at the United Nations. A UN tax convention negotiated on an equal basis between all states, creating an intergovernmental body under UN auspices to negotiate future reforms, and a UN Centre for Monitoring Taxing Rights so that instead of everyone having to ask the OECD, please can we have some data, please can we have some analysis to understand what these proposals mean, that data is centrally held within a democratic and transparent institution, carrying out that analysis on an equal basis for everyone and making sure that all states have access to it. It is a UN tax convention that will ultimately deliver on this. And almost certainly only a UN tax convention. And that's why we're seeing a growing momentum to say, this is the thing that we need. This is where we need to focus, because it's catalytic to all of the other areas of progress that we need to finally end this imperial process of illicit financial flows from which we all suffer. So how do you deliver that agenda inclusively? And inclusive is the key word here. Here's the momentum. The Mbeki panel, the African Union Economic Commission for Africa high-level panel on illicit flows out of Africa, is kind of the key moment that sets this in motion as a current live political process. Now, the final report of the panel, still, if you go back and look at it, you know, in some ways, because it was the first of its kind, a certain amount of it seems a bit dated now. They're stating things that seem kind of obvious, but it's actually really forward-looking and prescient. And when you go through it, you find things, you know, the call for very clear areas of progress. This is the most obvious one. The United Nations should play a more coherent and visible role in tackling illicit financial flows. And there's a discussion of architecture that follows this, even though the idea of a UN convention at this stage was largely unthinkable. You know, even the idea of a sustainable development goals target would have been, you know, wildly ambitious at this stage, although that's what did follow because of the importance of this report. Then you have, off the back of that, in a sense, but also preceding it in some areas, the Africa Group playing a particularly important role within the G77, and the G77 leading in calling at various times and tabling motions that are blocked by leading OECD members for an intergovernmental body, for the upgrading of the UN Tax Committee from technical to political intergovernmental status. This agenda continues to grow, even though it's blocked at every stage. Then the United Nations Secretary General's initiative on financing for development during the pandemic, despite the fact that this was in a sense the most conservative process with the dominance of some major OECD members, also recommended a UN tax convention. Here's a quote. I'll tell you a quick story about this. A UN tax convention is also recommended, inter alia, to mobilize the maximum available revenues, address tax abuse and avoidance, and ensure the necessary fiscal and policy space for an effective recovery. This recommendation was flagged as one of the leading recommendations in the report that was called the Menu of Options for the Consideration of Ministers of Finance, a report just before a meeting of Ministers of Finance in, I think, September 2020. This was on the website of the United Nations for less than 24 hours before the report was taken down and hastily replaced with one with exactly the same text, but without any of the official formatting, and one difference in the text, which was that this recommendation was removed from its central position, still hidden away in the back, but taken out of its foreground position because of the complaints, the immediate complaints of leading OECD members. So highly contested, even though it had emerged from the negotiations between states and the discussions of experts that underpinned this recommendation. That was followed in 2021 by the report of the high-level FACTI panel, perhaps the most explicit and lengthy statement in terms of laying out what a UN tax convention could be and what it's needed for. The international community, the FACTI panel said, must ensure that the norms they develop have broad legitimacy, by making sure they are framed and negotiated in an inclusive manner. This is the key point. That has not been the case for international tax norms. They said the quiet bit aloud, if you like. You know, the Fact panel made itself very unpopular by being absolutely explicit about the way and the extent to which the OECD, the Financial Action Task Force, are not inclusive, are not just in the way they operate in between countries at different income levels, members and non-members. A UN tax convention with universal participation should be initiated. The Fact panel could not have been clearer in expressing what in a sense is a consensus from those outside the OECD. That momentum continues. Since then, the South Centre, the intergovernmental group with I think 54 country members, has put out a really important briefing on this, calling in particular for a framework convention on tax, so the equivalent of the UNFCCC on climate change, but for tax, to be able to deliver on the set of different areas that we need a tax convention to deliver. That was followed by a full text draft convention prepared by Eurodad and the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, which details exactly how you could make sure you were capturing the ABC of transparency, that set of measures, in a way that includes countries at all income levels in the benefits, how you would go about changing the architecture, including that central data repository to create accountability, but also access for everyone, and crucially, the basis for an intergovernmental tax body to negotiate future changes to the tax rules. It is clear that a UN tax convention is now seen as the way of delivering on this whole agenda, and we should be enthused by this and focus very much on how we take this forward. Now, this week, as I began by saying, and I will wrap up in the next couple of minutes, we have now this statement of explicit political support from the African Union and Economic Commission for Africa Conference of Ministers. And this is a really significant step forward because this is an explicit political statement of unanimity across the region, this region of Africa, which has led on so much of this as a global policy agenda, and where we must, hope to see and support that leadership continuing now. Again, the Conference of Ministers calls upon the United Nations to begin negotiations under its auspices on an international convention on tax matters, with the participation of all states, members, and relevant stakeholders, aimed at eliminating base erosion, profit shifting, tax evasion, including of capital gains tax, and other tax abuses. This is the basis, or should be the basis, for the United Nations to really move forward almost immediately on this. The question, from a civil society perspective is what we do to accelerate this as quickly as possible. For member states and for other states, for UN agencies, there's a question of how you can engage with this, what your role can be. I think an immediate step then, but this is in a sense a kind of a quick agenda, what we do now. We need to maximize the political ownership of this decision at the African Union, make sure that member states are fully engaged with what they have committed to and willing to take it out publicly, and make this demand heard. And so alongside that, we need to raise the global awareness of this decision. We need to make sure everyone knows that the African Union has collectively made this call on the United Nations. Then we need to look to other regions of the world to see the degree of support there. Is there a Latin American position that could be taken equivalent to this, for example? And for each other region, where is the support? What is the breadth and depth of the support? Is there opposition? What is the nature of the opposition? We need to look within the UN system. Where are the agencies that need to get behind this to take it forward? to build their own mandate to work in support of this crucial call? Which are the UN agencies whose leaders can step up and take the mantle that the African Union has thrown down in front of them? And among OECD countries, where are the blockers? Who will stand up and say, we do not think the African Union are right, or we do not think they should be allowed to have their way on this, because we want to keep the power to make those decisions at the rich countries club at the OECD? Who's willing to say that publicly and defend it and put their political capital into blocking movements towards a genuinely inclusive process in which each country is able to vote? Because it is the voting, and Abdul Chowdhury of the South Centre was making this point, which is the crucial point very clearly. The intergovernmental tax body that will eventually arise from this, and the negotiating process itself to put a convention together, has to be based around the idea that states vote, not that there is some quiet process where the G7 exert their influence and that's it, and are never even held publicly accountable for their view. We know the power dynamics allow and, in a sense, continue to exist within UN settings. But as we've seen in the UNFCCC, when a country like the United States is blocking the global progress and is forced to vote and defend publicly their vote to do that, there is enormous pressure for them to take a less regressive stance. That doesn't mean that an intergovernmental tax body coming from UN Tax Convention will immediately see everyone come to the side of light and vote the right way, but it gives a chance for accountability, a chance to move that dynamic, to shift the positions of countries, many of whose own citizens simply won't know the role that they're playing in blocking progress. And that is the only way that this becomes a more genuinely political process, with a prospect of delivering finally the progress we need against illicit financial flows. What we need to do, what the African Union collectively have now demanded, is to start those negotiations. And it's incumbent now on all of us, including in civil society, to take the challenge that the African Union has given us, has given the United Nations too, and get those negotiations started. So this is a moment of enormous opportunity, and we collectively should take it, should respond to this African leadership, and play our role too. Let me finish there. I think that's around about the hour that I was probably supposed to speak for. Very much looking forward to questions on this, and thinking about how we do move this forward. But for now, thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was very enlightening. I've enjoyed the presentation. I'm just looking to the chat. I can't see any questions on there, but I'll sort of just throw it to the participants. Does anybody have a question? You can simply unmute your microphone and ask your question. It can be as simple as or as technical as you'd like it to be. We have a range of attendees with different levels of knowledge, so we're happy to sort of take on whatever questions you may have.
Hello, Alex, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you. Quick question. How do we interrogate the OECD countries' position? How do we actually sort of do that? Because there's very little available when you go and look.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, that's part of the problem in a sense. When you look at, or talk with the G77 negotiators, for example, in New York, their experience when they've put forward as they have done, twice in the last 3 years, proposals for the intergovernmental tax body. Their experience is that the blocking is largely done in the sort of the private negotiations before there is any public stage. So what you don't see is, I think I can name this because enough different people have done, what you don't see is the United States, the United Kingdom, Liechtenstein, would you believe, being the ones who kind of, put the knife in and remove time and again the text relating to these points. Getting to a stage where that is required to be done in public would itself be progress. And one thing the G77 did in the last round at the end of 2021 was they insisted on keeping some of that text in to the stage where the objections have to become public. So we did see some public objections from some OECD members before the final vote. So that's, it at least gives you a little accountability. But look, our sense is, that the way the OECD members approached this when there was a kind of full debate around it in Addis Ababa back in 2014, 15, was in a sense, they decided they needed to split the G77 before they themselves split. That's, we might think that's kind of very bad behavior, but in a sense, the rest of the world has to do the opposite. They have to work out how to split the OECD before the G77 splits. Now, we know privately that there are a number of European and European Union member states who are supportive of this, partly because they see, the OECD failing to deliver for them too. The OECD has been negotiating corporate tax reforms for 10 years now, and there's still no prospect of the significant progress we need. So there is frustration even among the relatively empowered OECD members, but getting that out into the public is harder. So again, having negotiations on a UN convention moving forward creates the space for people to express positions on the different aspects of this and gets them past the stage, but I think a lot of them are currently in, where by inertia, they sort of block this as a reflexive, no, the OECD is our group, our guys doing this, it's fine. Even when they, there's a kind of a complete incoherence about that, because they know that that's not working either at the OECD or at the Financial Action Task Force. So I think it's, we can think about a process of moving this forward. But look, for civil society within individual OECD members, this is an opportunity now to get your government on the record, get a parliamentary debate. Does the government back moving forward with negotiations on the UN tax convention as the African Union has proposed, has called for, or does the government oppose it? Starting to be able to gather that information and have it in the public domain will be really useful for working on advocacy, but will also generate some accountability, at least for those states. So I think for civil society in those high income countries, that's kind of the key responsibility now. Where is your government on this? Are you holding them accountable for blocking if that's what they're doing, or are you pushing them to be a bit braver if they're able to support it?
Thank you so much for that elaborate response. If Bernadette doesn't have any follow-up questions, I see Sakshi has put the hand up. So Sakshi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miri. No, thank you, Alex.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alex, for that wonderful presentation. It was very enlightening, as usual. So could you talk a little bit about the underlying need for cooperation among countries with respect to the global asset registry proposal? Even among the public beneficial owner registries, there are different legal definitions and thresholds of how a country identifies who an ultimate beneficial owner is and what kind of legal entities does that registry cover. So my question is, how do we get around to finalizing a definition of what an asset is? Because there may be different cultural practices that recognize asset differently. So yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks, Sakshi. That's a really good question. And I think I guess I think there are sort of two channels almost around the idea of a global asset register. It's perhaps worth saying, just for context for others, this is an idea that sort of came to prominence when Thomas Piketty included it in his as one of the central policy proposals in his book Capital in the 21st Century. But the proposal sort of goes back to Gabriel Zucman, one of Piketty's then doctoral students. Although you can see versions of it around in political discussion in previous decades, but sort of the modern call for it comes from there. Now, Piketty put it forward on the basis of his analysis of the French Revolution, in a sense, in 1789. And he makes the argument that one of the only things after the revolution was sort of overturned and effectively, kind of aristocratic power was re-established in France. One of the only, I think there was another one, but I can't remember, but so one of two policy reforms from the revolution that were kept in place was the creation of a land register. Now, this is a period in time when land is basically wealth. Right? So a land register is the register of public wealth. Now, what that did was it allowed a couple of different things to happen. One was it created the possibility always for people to understand the nature and extent of wealth inequality nationally, and therefore to consider whether policy responses were ever needed at different points to the degree of inequality. And I think that is a vital role for the Global Asset Register. We need to know just how unequal the world we're living in is. The kind of the uncounted graphic I put up earlier, part of the argument I make there in that book is that people have very clear preferences about inequality, and we expect our political systems to mediate them so that we end up with the inequality that is socially preferred. But if we're actually never measuring the true inequality, it's always much higher than what we measure. What we're doing is agreeing, in effect, to have a level of inequality that is much higher than the one that we want and the one we think we have. So having that information available, accurate information on inequality, is kind of crucial for our politics to make the choices about what kind of inequality we're willing to tolerate. Now, the other piece is that it allows you to see individuals' asset ownership, which in turn allows you to make sure that taxes and law enforcement can be effective, whether you're thinking about sanctioning Russian oligarchs or just basic taxes on capital gains or wealth or incomes or so on, or the rule of law in other areas, curbing illicit financial flows. Look, Piketty, though, makes the argument that it's difficult to get that without some kind of motivation that's beyond saying transparency is good, because the reason we don't have that information in the public domain is because of the political power of people who want to go uncounted, people who are benefiting very substantially from the fact that their assets and income streams are not seen, are not registered. Why would those people who are spending their time resisting progressive taxation want to allow more information in the public domain about how extreme the position is? So Piketty proposes a global wealth tax at a level of almost zero as a way of making sure that governments have to collect the data, and so you cut through that. Now, what he doesn't get into is how you create the political will to have a global wealth tax. And so in a sense, you're just shifting the focus of it. But I think that's a way in to think about it. If we want to cut through a lot of the technical arguments about what beneficial ownership assets, what beneficial ownership registers we have for which assets, it would be to say, look, we want a national tax on wealth that covers all of these assets. And then almost by necessity, if that goes through, and increasingly we have political momentum in a lot of countries for wealth taxes, if that goes through, you have the requirement that the information be collected so that the tax can be effective. And that may be a kind of a political shortcut to forcing the changes on the transparency side that are needed. But that's coming from one end. From the other end, thinking about just the call for a global asset register, I think we may see most progress through almost a less radical and just a more practical process. Because of all the progress that's been made in the last 10 years, we have a lot of registers of beneficial ownership for companies. Now, a lot of those registers, as you suggest, actually, are not great. They have flaws. Either, for example, they don't capture ownership if the share is less than 25% or something that high that it's very easy to gain. And we think there should be really no threshold there. But if you're going to have a threshold, it needs to be 1% or less, or something to make it much harder to game it. But also the definitions that are involved aren't always very good. And sometimes you end up with the legal owner, not the ultimate beneficial owner. So you get the next level in the structure, the next company or the next legal vehicle, not the warm-blooded human being who ultimately has the control. So we do need consistency across these. And then across different assets, well, we have lots of land registers and property registers, not all of which are very good, but we have them in a great many countries. And then we have some beneficial ownership registers for other sorts of legal vehicles, for trusts and foundations and partnerships. Again, there are not so many of them and they're not so good. Often there are kind of complexities there that have allowed people to create loopholes. When David Cameron, as UK Prime Minister, led a process around company beneficial ownership transparency around the international meetings they hosted in 2013, the UK effectively excluded trusts because, of course, trusts are a key part of the British imperial financial secrecy architecture. And that's continuing to have a legacy that we haven't moved forward as fast on trusts as we have with other legal vehicles. Then other assets, yachts, aircraft, high value works of art, gold and other valuable commodities. We have in different countries, different jurisdictions, some registers for some of these, but again, quite a lot of variation. So you could say, look, the technical solution to this is to nail it, is to say this is exactly what needs to be done for each type of asset. And these are all the assets that we need to have registers for. And what we have to do is get a perfect register for every asset class, every jurisdiction, everywhere. And then we'll do a global asset register. But I think that's a way of getting nowhere quite quickly. The practical approach from the other end is to say, let's create a global asset register, and we could do it tomorrow. You know, the UK pilot that ICRICT did, in a sense, points towards that. It says, look, we've got some information in registers, public or private, for lots of different asset classes. We could join that all together. Now, it would still be imperfect. We'd have all the imperfections in it, but we'd create the architecture of, first of all, a national asset register that would have public and private elements. So law enforcement would be able to see some of that information. The public would be able to see, or all of it rather, and the public would be able to see some of it. That would already move forward your ability to talk about wealth distribution, to make the argument around wealth taxes, and the ability to fight illicit financial flows without any better information being included, just joining up what we have. So there's a really strong argument just to focus on the practicalities, and then to start doing that at the regional and the global level. So we now have the Green political party in the European Parliament has adopted the call for a European asset register, partly in response to the arguments around sanctions on Russian oligarchs, to say, look, Europe isn't bad in terms of beneficial ownership registers for companies and even increasingly for trusts and foundations. Let's stick it all together. Let's create that cross-border asset register that might also be the basis for global progress, or at least be us doing our part. So I think probably that practical way forward is going to be where things move, and thinking about things like the identifiers that we use for individuals, kind of tax identification numbers, something on that basis, and then the legal entity identifiers that allow us to join these up effectively are the kind of the boring but necessary technical steps to that practical progress. If at the same time, there's also some of us on the other side saying, making the arguments at the individual level of particular registers of particular asset types, you need a register, you need to make this better, you need to improve the thresholds, the definitions, the practicalities of this. From that end, I think we're on a good road. But the political pressure around wealth taxes is perhaps the one that's going to cut through. And groups like the Fight Inequality Alliance globally, groups like Latindad and La Red de Justicia Fiscal in Latin America are really starting to push those arguments around wealth taxes in ways that are going to make this increasingly necessary. No, I'm sorry, that's a very long answer, but I think it's such a good question, and there are so many key bits there. I should say also, the Tax Justice Network is now having a series of events, starting with the Financial Secrecy Index launch earlier this week. The next one in 2 weeks' time is exactly on the Global Asset Registry, and so we'll talk through a lot of these issues with a really kind of high-level panel. And the series will end on the 30th of June, no, the 28th of June, with a high-level event on the UN Tax Convention. So we're hoping by then to have really built on the momentum from the African Union's decision. So do please sign up for this event series and join us in those conversations.
Thank you, Alex, for that elaborate response. I can see just a comment that Matti Kohonen has made, and he says that, actually his hand is up, so maybe I'll just give him the opportunity to speak. So Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, hi Alex, hi everyone. It's just a quick comment. In a way, there already is a system of a global asset register, and it's Orbis, and it used to be owned by Bureau van Dijk in the Netherlands. It was bought by Moody's recently, and they do join all beneficial ownership registries in their database. And they also have yachts, and through the Global Shipping Registry by Lloyd's that they include there. Of course, that's not accessible to everyone. If you happen to have a university nearby where you can access, many universities have a license to it, but not to the full Orbis, but many governments do have that. So I think we could have a look at what they've done and see if through kind of civil society and universities and other kind of organizations we could work towards a bit something similar, or see what they've done and expand it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think, there's all sorts of, if you're thinking as a researcher, there's all sorts of criticisms of that data set and the weaknesses in it. But in terms of thinking about just moving practically forward, it's clearly, it's a very useful chunk of data, and also starts to tell you some things about where you need to focus on improvements. I think ultimately we need to see this data in the public domain, but for now, yeah, all of the workarounds that we can use and all of the data that we can bring together one way or another is useful to further our understanding of what the distribution looks like, but also what is possible and how we make it better.
Thank you, Alex. I see Maria has her hand up, so maybe Maria, you can pose your question.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you very much, Alex, for the excellent presentation. You might have covered this before because I joined a little bit late, but would you mind reminding us which countries in the G77 and also particularly in the African Union are taking the lead? Which ones might be slightly blocking it? And I guess that there is also another cluster of countries that stand somehow in the middle. And you were talking about like putting governments in the spot, particularly the OECD governments. But I guess that there is also an opportunity for advocacy to put governments from the G77 on the spot to see where they are and why they are not pushing more strongly in this sense for the UN Convention and for other progressive tax reforms. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Yeah, so that's an interesting one. I think there is a question of sort of balance, thinking, you know, from the Tax Justice Network side. I think, you know, we look internationally and think, where's the real priority? What do we need to move? And I think that, you know, what you'd see is that there are some key blockers that we really need to be addressing. But for national and regional civil societies, particularly outside of those high-income country blockers, there is a real question about, you know, how supportive is your government, and how willing are they to be public about their support if they are supportive, and to what extent might they be dragging their heels. So on the face of it, you know, the answer to the couple of questions you pose is that the G77 group at the United Nations is fully and comprehensively supportive, and they've continually put this or elements of this on the agenda, even when they've known that it's going to be blocked by some big OECD members. That's also true now with this really important statement from the African Union and Economic Commission for Africa meeting of ministers of finance, which is also unanimous, right? They have supported as a collective, or rather they have made as a collective a call directly on the United Nations to begin negotiations on a tax convention. But, okay, if you are, you know, national civil society in Malawi, Nigeria, you're probably feeling pretty positive that your government has been more openly supportive of this. And Nigeria's role at the G77 and the Africa Group has been, over a number of years, has been, you know, leading on this very clearly. Lots of other countries, though, haven't really tied their colours to the mast in a public way. A number of countries have intervened in UN discussions on this. And I think in general, where countries have the chance from within the G77, they have been supportive. I think the most obvious, if not outright opposition, certainly heel dragging, has come, as you might expect, from one of the leading secrecy jurisdictions within the G77, which is Singapore. And so, you know, a definite question there for whether or not they're on board with the G77 position. Within Africa, you know, you might particularly want to interrogate the position of Mauritius, the Seychelles, Liberia, perhaps, that, you know, tend to offer more financial secrecy. But perhaps the key priority within the African Union would be South Africa. Now, South Africa has consistently, but not very publicly, often not publicly at all, has effectively backed the OECD, with which it works closely, against African Union positions. And that's really worrying. And the fact that that's happening largely privately, I think, is significant. South Africa, you know, wants to continue to present itself as, you know, a champion for the continent, but it's clear that it's Nigeria in this context that's really been doing that. While that's not very public, I don't think South Africa's government is too worried. But I think if it becomes a subject of public debate, that South Africa appears to be pushing OECD positions against the African Union consensus, I think that's politically much harder for it to maintain as a position. But even, you know, if it's going to maintain it, it should be forced to do so publicly. And I think that's kind of a key point. One thing that we're doing over the next 6 months or so is going live with a policy tracker that will actually contain data on each country, on both the positions they have and the kind of policies they've got in place, the kind of stuff we capture in the Financial Secrecy Index and the Corporate Tax Haven Index, but also their stated policy positions. And that will include whether or not they're in favour of negotiations on a UN tax convention. So one thing I'd ask is that, you know, national, regional, civil society members engage with us in that process, both using that data to see the positions of their governments that are reflected, but also feeding in data, because you'll have much better immediate analysis of governance positions than we do. So I'm hoping that's kind of a tool that can really help that. And Chennai has just put in the chat, the civil society group on financing for development has a really useful bit of tracking work specifically on the tax body and the tax convention ideas, which is, you know, really valuable for people to see where their governments are. Lastly, thinking about OECD country governments, I think that's vital. You know, civil society in those countries has to step up now. The African Union has called for the UN to begin negotiations. The only reason that won't happen, you know, that's more than 50 members of the 200 or so members of the UN calling on the UN to do something. The only reason that won't start moving is because of a handful of the most powerful countries blocking it. So civil society in those countries has to be putting on the pressure, starting with just asking the question, are you supporting the African Union on this call to begin negotiations? If not, why not? Let's get that in the public domain. Let's push governments like mine to have to defend publicly their opposition, if opposition is their position, and start to get governments, you know, probably beginning with some of the more progressive members of the European Union, governments within the OECD on the record saying that they too support this. That in turn will make it easier for governments at all income levels to come out publicly in favour of this, to make it safe, in a sense, for governments that haven't really quite committed yet to come out publicly and do so. And also, and importantly, to make it safe for leaders within the UN system, the heads of UN bodies, and indeed ultimately the people around the Secretary General, to come out publicly in favour of this, rather than to see this kind of scared of their own shadow reversals of public positions that we've had, that I've talked about in the presentation. We have to make it easier to support this publicly, and we have to create a political dynamic that at least means there is some transparency and some political impact for countries that oppose it, instead of letting them keep opposing it in the shadows without any political cost at all.
Thank you so much for that elaborate response. I have a couple of questions of my own, but I'll just pause one that Bosiri has indicated in the chat there, where he's saying that he doesn't see that there's a big push for introduction of wealth taxes in developing countries, and he wonders, you know, why is that the case?
That's a good question. So let me give two answers. One is that I think actually there is quite a big push, but it's less visible perhaps across Africa than it is across some of the regions. So I think in Latin America and in Europe, you are seeing a level of political and public debate around wealth taxes that certainly I don't remember in the last 20 years. And even in the US, it's not a complete minority view anymore. There is some, polite public debate in the mainstream also about the possibility, about some different ways of taxing, particularly the sort of the extreme wealth of billionaires. But to the extent that it is true that isn't common across the board. But I would love people to jump in if, particularly if there are people on the call from different African countries where this is a live political issue. I'm not aware from, a million miles away of a lot of debate within most African countries on it. But I think the Fight Inequality Alliance has been globally a key body pushing it. And they have a lot of members who are grassroots organizations working on different issues of social justice in individual countries across Africa and across the world. And there, I think the wealth tax has become an increasingly important part of their platform. So the Fight Inequality Alliance is partnering with us on the event on the Global Asset Register that is in 2 weeks' time. And that's kind of interesting because the other partner is ICRICT, the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, this kind of relatively high-level technical body that's really led the technical work on the Global Asset Register. So you have them at one end, and then at the other side you have the Fight Inequality Alliance, this much broader-based grassroots movement that isn't sort of focused on those technical issues at all, but is focused on wealth taxes as a kind of a key element of a progressive policy agenda. So I think it is moving, and there is growing momentum, but there is a long way to go to. And we've only really seen Argentina as a case in the last few years of a country introducing a significant wealth tax, and and raising very quickly, far beyond the the claims of critics beforehand. They raised literally several $1 billion in the first year, and that's before they have any of the kind of information architecture in place that you really need to do a wealth tax fully. So I think that's a good illustration that even for a government to move forward today with a wealth tax at the same time as recognizing that they don't have all the information they need can still be very useful in revenue terms. And of course, it puts you on a path to getting the data that you need to really make it work more effectively. I think we'll see that more and more, the kind of normalizing of the idea. We know we'll get all these scare stories, because we always do, from the wealthy and their lobbyists saying, oh no, all of the rich people will move away, or people will simply hide their assets and you'll never get any tax off them. No, actually, the reason that there is so much lobbying against this is because people know that wealth taxes are effective, and they come in a way that income taxes at the top end just aren't effective. And wealth is just accumulated income, right? So we should not be afraid of taxing it. And we should recognize that a great deal of the wealth distribution in the world is illegitimate. We live in countries where a great deal of the wealth, still the distribution of wealth, depends on the process of imperial extraction that I've talked about, but also in countries where, until very recently, in some cases still today, there is an embedded patriarchy in the distribution of wealth, which means it isn't, or wasn't until very recently in many countries, possible for women to own assets or to inherit assets through family relationships. So, and then of course, we live in a world where, empire has racialized us so comprehensively that, what's the wealth distribution we have? It is overwhelmingly white, upper class men who dominate the wealth distribution. That's not legitimate. That's not because people who look or sound a bit like me have done anything good ever. Quite the opposite, right? We are the continuing beneficiaries of people who look and sound like us, who have excluded people who don't, women, Black people in particular, but also indigenous populations all around the world, and so on. the distribution of wealth globally is fundamentally illegitimate. And if we need one good reason to start taxing it properly in order to generate revenues that we can use for the benefit of everyone, it should be that. There is no argument that wealth is the result of people doing better and working hard. You know, that's nonsense on stilts. So we should crack on with wealth taxes as soon as possible.
Thank you. We have just a question from Julie asking if you're coming up with a statement by civil society to support the AUECA statement.
That is a very good point, Julie. Thank you. And yes, the reason there's been a slight disconnect between the Council of Ministers or the ministerial conference making this position and a reaction from us or the broader movement is just because there was a slight communication issue. It wasn't absolutely clear that the draft ministerial statement had gone through unopposed, which is what I now know did happen, and so we can talk about this as being fully backed by the African Union ministers. So yes, and I will be in touch about that, but we'll be putting out public statements and yeah, pulling together something for civil society. I hope the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, our sister organisation, which is the umbrella body for mass mobilisation organisations around the world, will lead on that, and we will certainly support as strongly as we can. But that's exactly what we need to do as an immediate piece of awareness raising. Let us all be clear that this has happened and that we support it strongly, and we expect our governments now to work in support of it, and the United Nations also.
Thank you, Alex. I think for me, maybe just one question is the issue of sovereignty. When we look at the debates revolving around international tax organizations and the convention, what would your response be to that sort of criticism that we're interfering with, tax sovereignty by creating such a body?
Thanks, Mary. Look, this is an important point. I'm glad you raised that, because there's because you're right. This is an argument, a counter argument that comes back. Certainly since the late 1990s, it has consistently been used by, I would say, particularly the kind of the extreme right wing within a set of OECD countries, but also by particularly some of the smaller secrecy jurisdictions. And the argument, for those who have had the good fortune not to hear this, the argument roughly goes, if we start making rules and setting standards on tax and financial transparency internationally, doing this in cooperation with each other, you are threatening the tax sovereignty of individual states to make their own choices about these important tax issues. Now, superficially, that's an appealing argument, right? Tax, for all the reasons I've laid out this morning, not least, tax is fundamental to effective states, and so tax sovereignty, the ability of states to set their own, to take their own decisions, reflecting their citizens' preferences, is equally vital. So, okay, does it then follow that we shouldn't do things in cooperation because that might involve trade-offs where we give up sovereignty? No. In fact, it's almost the complete reverse. The biggest threat to tax sovereignty, and I hope I've kind of made this clear today, the biggest threat to statehood and the role of tax in supporting statehood is the failure of inclusive international cooperation. If tax choices of states only affected the economic activity and the resulting assets and income streams within that state, then this simple tax sovereignty argument would kind of work, right? Because nothing that you did at the level of your state would ever have extraterritorial impacts. But that's not the world we live in, and it hasn't been for at least 200 years. In fact, the tax choices made by individual states are fundamental to the tax sovereignty of other states. When the United States refuses to tell any other country about their tax residents' bank accounts in the United States, it undermines the tax sovereignty of every other country. It is the lack of cooperation that threatens sovereignty. And for the United States to provide that information about other countries' tax residents' financial accounts within the United States would have no impact on the tax sovereignty of the United States. They'd give up nothing in order to stop damaging the tax sovereignty of everyone else. And that's the dynamic, in fact, that is the crucial one in all of this. By coming together, we can defend the tax sovereignty of each of our states. By failing to do that, we leave ourselves exposed to the most aggressive, most antisocial practices of the most secretive and the least cooperative jurisdictions. The difficulty we've got, though, is that we're not talking so much about those two extremes, everyone for themselves or everyone in an international or UN tax convention. We've got this really damaging position in the middle where we do have international tax and financial transparency rules and standards being set by international bodies, but those bodies are not legitimate. The Financial Action Task Force is dominated by the same set of OECD countries that dominates the OECD. They effectively set the rules and standards for everyone, but only those countries' voices are heard, are effective in influencing the rules and standards that are set. So we all lose sovereignty in both ways. We lose sovereignty because those rules and standards don't stop the most damaging behaviors that other countries are doing to our country. And we lose sovereignty because the decisions that are made don't reflect the views of our states and our citizens, for most of us, outside of that handful of dominant OECD members. And even there, most of their citizens' views aren't being reflected either, because the people of the UK, of the United States, are not in favour of the tax havenry of their countries. If you ask them about it, they don't want to behave like that, and they themselves want more progressive taxation. That's a consistent finding from polling. They want lower inequality in their own countries, never mind stopping the damage that they do to others. So these are not processes that support tax sovereignty in any way. In fact, they're undermining it in both dimensions. But look, we shouldn't, the fact that the OECD is illegitimate shouldn't ever be an argument against having a legitimate and inclusive international mechanism for cooperation. It's what we all need to defend our own tax sovereignty. And that, I think over the last 20, 30 years, the turnaround in that argument from tax sovereignty being a reason to block, a reason not to cooperate, to tax sovereignty being understood as a crucial reason why, for example, the European Union has a level of tax cooperation ahead of any other bloc. It's not because they're all oppressed, poor little countries. It's because they're powerful countries that see that cooperation protects their sovereignty. That's the kind of dynamic that we need to embrace globally. We are all better off. We are all able to enjoy more tax sovereignty when we cooperate, but only in a context where every vote, every voice is given weight, not the illegitimate and unequal institutions that we have dominating at the moment.
Thank you so much. Very useful. I see you have 4 minutes left, and maybe the final question that I would ask, seeing as that there's no more in the chat, is what would multilateralism look like? Should we adopt a UN tax convention? And you know, what safeguards are there against falling into the trap that the OECD has fallen into with its multilateralism? I wonder.
Yeah, that's a good question. Look, so I'm not going to sit here and wouldn't be legitimate to kind of sit here and say, this is it, this is the model, it looks like this, everyone should agree with me and we'll all do this. In a sense, that itself needs to emerge from inclusive negotiations, which we've never had on any aspect of these issues. So I think in some ways we need to see this as a very open process. My guess is that, you know, I think we will go into negotiations on a convention, but my guess is that it will be done in a very open way. I think that there's a convention process beginning or recently begun on around plastics. And I think the initial position there that the Secretariat has brought to negotiation includes, in a sense, all possibilities. It could be a UN convention or not a UN convention. It could be a framework convention or not a framework convention. In a sense, what we're talking about is the negotiation of a multilateral instrument of some sort. So you might not even end up calling it a convention, it could be a treaty. I mean, in the sense that that difference isn't necessarily terribly significant. If what it does adheres to the kind of the key principles, in the sense it does exactly not what the OECD does. So that would mean a few things that, you know, I think are sort of essential and not negotiable. So one is that every state party to the instrument or the convention is included in decision making, that there is a voting process and that is public, so that states can be held accountable by their own citizens as well as by each other. You remove the lack of transparency in the OECD processes that allows those who are really taking the decisions to hide the fact that they're even doing it. So they have the power without the accountability. This process, whatever it ends up looking like, must reverse that. There must, you know, we can't remove the power dynamics of the world that we're in. There are countries with much more power than others, but we can at least require that be exercised transparently in a way that allows it to be accountable both to countries' own citizens and to each other. So that transparency and that voting process is necessary. And, you know, within that, it's pretty clear, I think, that the United Nations is the obvious model for sort of how that works. You know, the United Nations, for all that it's the successor of the League of Nations, you know, the group of imperial powers, has become broadly globally inclusive and has a legitimacy that nobody else has. You know, a sign of the United Nations success in that, if you like, is just how quickly the imperial powers and settler states took the power to set tax rules out of the United Nations, you know, within 10, 15 years, really, of its establishment, and put that power into the OECD. You know, that tells you about the UN's ability to hold these globally inclusive and transparent negotiations. So I think, without kind of narrowing it more than that, that's got to be, you know, central to what comes out. And then, you know, I think there's a great deal of space for member states to choose how exactly this instrument and an intergovernmental tax body that would come out of it is set up, how it's resourced, what the Secretariat looks like. whether the data function, this Centre for Monitoring Taxing Rights, sits within it or is a bit separate, playing a kind of independent role, providing data and perhaps also assessing proposals. All of that, I think, can be agreed, and and states should be sovereign in putting forward their views, rather than me or anyone else kind of outside thinking we can say there's one way to do it and it's my way. But I think that's the context in which the decision making needs to take place. If the decision making is inclusive, transparent and accountable, all the things that the OECD process is not, then I think we're in a good place to see this develop.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So one last question from Stephen. Stephen asks, what's your picture of success if the disclosure proposals were to be implemented? And related to this, are there any proposals on how developing countries can build tax capacity to effectively allocate additional tax income as a result of improved transparency?
Good questions both. Thank you. In terms of success, I think I'd probably go back to, I think I had it on sort of briefly on one of the slides, the ABC of transparency. We need automatic exchange of information about financial accounts between all countries, not the current version in which most lower income countries are excluded and in which the United States refuses to cooperate without any consequences. We need full beneficial ownership transparency, registers for companies, trusts, foundations, all legal vehicles, partnerships, and also high value assets. And we need that joined up in a global asset register. We need country by country reporting by multinational companies so that we can see and hold to account their profit shifting and the action of jurisdictions that facilitate their profit shifting. So that's the kind of the outline of the transparency needed on the international side, but we also need domestically much better and more consistent transparency about tax incentives, tax expenditures, how much they cost our countries, who benefits, and parliamentary scrutiny on an annual basis of whether that's a good use of taxpayers' money. And all of that together gives you a chance of, A, dramatically curbing the illicit financial flows and the revenue losses and the corruption damage that they do, and also of improving the transparency and accountability of each of our states in the way that they use our money, how they're spending it and how well that's going. In terms of building tax capacity, this isn't rocket science, and any tax authority, you can sit down and they can tell you in the nicest possible way, and they'll be very polite about the support they get from the OECD and from bilateral donors, and yes, that's very good and useful. The issue isn't that tax authorities don't know how to do stuff. It's that they don't have information because they are locked out of these international processes because of the injustices of the OECD system, and they don't have the resources. There's also an element of having operational independence. Sometimes their own governments block them from doing the kind of the progressive enforcement of taxation because it's the elites who are the least tax compliant. And tax authorities can just be stopped politically from enforcing compliance against elites. So we need to empower our tax authorities, both with financial resources and politically, for them to be able to do this, and with access to information internationally. We don't need more and more and more OECD capacity building. We just need to allow these tax authorities to be more effective themselves. But then lastly, on that question of how additional tax income can be effectively allocated through improved transparency, I'd go back to some of the research I touched on. We know, and Bernadette O'Hare on this call has also done important research in this area. We know some basic things are on average and over time true, and these include the following. when governments are more reliant for their spending on tax rather than other sources of income, they are over time more likely to be better governed, less corrupt, and more responsive to their citizens, more effective in terms of being politically representative. And then secondly, any given spending that they do for the same amount of money, but where more of it's coming from tax rather than other sources, any given amount of public spending is more likely to deliver good outcomes, or will deliver better outcomes for the same amount of money, and will deliver outcomes that are more inclusive. When governments are more reliant on tax, the spending they do covers more of the population that is effectively paying them through that tax, because of the accountability relationships that tax generates. You know, because we don't like paying tax, we want to hold the government accountable when we think they're using our money. So there's this built-in mechanism that tax doesn't just generate more money. And when we have these transparency measures in place and we get more tax and we start to curb the tax losses, we don't just have more money, we have better spending, we have better governments, more effective representative states spending that money. And it's, you know, to finish, you know, the point I hope I made through the presentation, although the failure of the international mechanisms at the moment is robbing us all, and especially lower income countries, of tax revenues that we need, what it's ultimately doing that's more important is robbing us of statehood, or of the possibility of effective statehood, because it's giving us governments with less money to spend that are more likely to spend it badly, less likely to respond to our demands as citizens, and more likely to fall into corruption. There's a virtuous circle, if we can tap into it, of better tax, supporting better governments, delivering us eventually effective states. And it's that is robbed by illicit financial flows, and ultimately by the current and former imperial powers who are responsible for that. And this is why, you know, we need a UN tax convention, and we need to change the architecture, the basis on which decisions are made, so that there's an inclusive rule setting process. I think I've gone on far too long, and I'm sorry to have kind of given long answers, but that, you know, I think that's an important point, and I hope this has been valuable. And I hope, you know, the African Union statement of ministers really is the starting point to negotiations as they've called for, and that, you know, we look back in a couple of years and say the African leadership that we saw in this week of May 2022, following that of the high-level panel in 2015, has been absolutely catalytic to changing the world, you know, literally changing the world towards the kind of tax justice that we all need.
Thank you so much, Alex. Really enjoyed the presentation. I can see in the chat everybody sort of seconds that opinion, and yeah, it's been fantastic. Really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for the link. I think there's a lady, Chennai, has sent us that the link to the database. So for those interested, I'm definitely interested. Please click on that before we end the call. And yeah, it's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you for your presentation. And I think with that, we can close the meeting, unless anybody, yeah, I think we're ready to sort of close the meeting.
Look, thank you very much, Mary, and to the Committee for Fiscal Studies. I think you do an enormously important role, and it's been a pleasure to be able to speak with you.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you. Bye, guys.